Wonderful. What a privilege it is for me to be able to lead this next part of the program today, to have these extraordinary women leaders who have come together and who bring each of them a certain perspective on the challenges for women's rights and universal human rights. They come from different regions of the world, different kinds of work, and in our conversation, they'll share their insights, their experiences, their stories, and in doing so, help us think about how we shape this agenda together today that will lead us to a world where there is peace, security, prosperity, and universal human rights. It is a world that is possible, and these women believe that, as do you. They would not be able to continue with the work they carry on day in and day out, and the work that's represented in this room. It's been my experience, both as a journalist and as an activist around the world, that coming together as we have today is part of the work. Yeah. It provides an opportunity for us to share our stories and our experiences, but it also provides an incentive for us to realize that it is this community, our community of women leaders and the men who support us, that are responsible for changing the harsh realities that we have been reminded of again this morning. So I'm going to introduce these women briefly. Their full biographies are in your programs, and I'm sure their work is familiar to most of you. I'll ask each of them a question at the beginning, and we'll engage in a conversation on this very wide-ranging and important topic. And then at the end, if there's time, we hope to invite you to participate in our conversation. So I'm going to just briefly give you a description of each of their work and invite you to look further. And I'm going to try and find it on this iPad, which, of course, is just about to run out of power. It doesn't that always happen? But that is the one thing we know is not going to happen with this group today. They're not going to run out of power, and I don't really need it to tell you about them because I've had the opportunity to spend some time with them last night, and some of them I have known before. I'm going to start with Gay McDougall. Gay, actually, and I were born in the same part of the world. We discovered that last night at dinner, that we're both from Georgia, and that we grew up at the same time in a segregated South. And both of us came, I think, into our social activism at the same time and motivated by many of the same imperatives. Gay is an internationally known lawyer. She's a visiting professor of law currently at Fordham University. She has written and traveled extensively on the issue of human rights, in particular with the lens on race as well as gender. She was the first American appointed to the UN Commission to look at racial discrimination and to try and find an end to it in the world. And her work seems particularly important now as we look at all of the issues and challenges in nearly every country in this world being raised around refugee and migrant populations. And all of it brings us back to looking at race as a lens to understanding the need for and the challenges against finding universal human rights. So let's begin there, Gay, with your perspective as a U.S.-born lawyer, someone who has experienced both what you experienced as a child and what you again experienced working with Nelson Mandela in South Africa during that transition. Looking at the issue of race as a challenge to human rights.
Well, I think it is a challenge that is not fully recognized by many. I just want to start with thanking Zainab for, setting up this discussion that we have here today so well in terms of all of the issues that we have to look at. And I appreciate your focus on war, and I appreciate your focus on poverty. When I use the lens of race and minorities and migrants, et cetera, what I see in the world is that over 70% of the wars today have some element of ethnicity struggles in them. When I look at the face, this is an analogy to use, face of poverty, her face is the face of a woman of color. So right at the bottom of the well, the most excluded in the world are people who are being excluded on the basis of their race, ethnicity, their, in many ways, national origin, because they might be migrant populations, and also at the bottom of the well, they are women. So women of color are the most excluded. As I travel through the world for the United Nations, one of the things that is very apparent to me is, the ways in which people of color are excluded from the economies of their countries and from the world. Economic exclusion is one of the most used tools of racism. Given then the critical nature of where we as women of color sit in poverty in communities all over the world, the future that I see and that I wish for is one where we can imagine having grown beyond racism. And we can imagine living in an economy, a global economy, that has as its target meeting human needs, rather than being the focus of accumulation by individuals and accumulation primarily by certain countries in the world. So I see a world where we're not dealing with the staggering inequalities, both within and between countries. Now, this sounds extremely ambitious, and maybe people would react to this by saying, oh my gosh, you're talking about changing the whole economy of the globe. The answer is yes, I am. I think we have to be bold, but we have to also identify exactly what it is that is the main source of our problems and go for it. And I think that we can turn the systems around. They're not, forces of nature. Our economies are made by decisions that ultimately we should have under our control. Why can't we use something other than GDP to measure the success of an economy? Why can't we use the degree to which the economy is meeting human needs? Why can't we fight for all workers to have a living wage? Why can't we move women out of the position of having 2 or 3 jobs, including unpaid family, domestic care work? These are issues that you can break down and address. And I think that it is important that we come together to think through these issues, use our convening power, as Manaz does, and begin to identify clearly what we're after and how we get there step by step. And that's how I think the women's movement worldwide has been able to strategize over the last 20 years and to be one of the more successful civil society movements in the world.
I feel like you just gave the summation to the world's jewelry, right? I mean, all those questions that she raised for us as the jury making judgment about what we do in the world can all be answered yes, right? Yes, we can do all that. I was recently at a women's conference in Iceland, and someone was summing up all of the problems that we'll hear again and again today. And the answer was, well, look, let's just start with one thing. Be disobedient. So I think at the core of the very, very important perspective you've given us, Gay, based on your observations, is that it is going to take more than incremental change. Mm-hmm. And that is what each of these women are involved in their own work, definitely is the large global scaled change that is going to be essential to get us where we need to go. And Karima Bennoune knows certainly about that as well. Karima is a lawyer as well at the University of California at Davis. She has written so many fabulous articles and published by all of the world's great journals and newspapers. I spent quite a lot of time reading through them last night, and my goodness, we definitely recommend you look at terror torture, which is a key observation about the world we're living in post 9/11. And Karima's work is wide-ranging, having grown up in Algeria and in the U.S. But in particular, Karima, I'd like you to share their perspective, the regional, or the global perspective, really, of the human rights challenges for women living in Muslim communities. It's one of the issues that she addresses in her new book called Your Fatwa Doesn't Apply Here. And that book led to a very inspiring TED Talk, which you can find on TED.com, and also recommended viewing. But let's start there with the perspective of someone who grew up in Algeria, who lives and works in the U.S., and who comes at this perspective of the rights for women living in Muslim communities.
Thank you very much for this important question. Thank you so much to Manaz Afkhami and the Women's Learning Partnership for inviting me. It's such an honor to sit on the stage with my co-participants this morning and to be in this room with all of you. The first event that I ever spoke at, organized by Manaz Afkhami, was exactly 20 years ago, in fact, in Beijing. And it's amazing to me to be here talking about many of the same issues that we were talking about then. At that time, I was in Beijing to work in support of the delegation of women who had come from Algeria to speak about what was happening in the terrible armed conflict in the country at that time. And really, my feeling today, when you ask me what's my view of the region, my feeling today is we are paying for failing to learn the lessons of what was happening to Algeria then. There was a terrible armed conflict between the state and armed fundamentalist groups. Ultimately, about 200,000 people were killed. We don't know the exact numbers, but that's the one you hear most in the press. Very much like things that are happening today, the armed groups were practicing the so-called theology of rape. They used a theological, in their view, so-called theological justification of rape and sexual slavery, and the international community utterly failed to respond. That story was not covered internationally. No human rights organization did a single dedicated report about that topic, and the Algerian women had come to Beijing to try to get that issue on the international agenda. And that seemed, I think, to many people like a sort of obscure issue particular to Algeria. And yet now we see, and it wasn't even then, at the time Afghan women, for example, were dealing with many of precisely the same issues. But now we see these issues raised all across the region. And again, you hear from Algerian women, why were people not listening to what we were saying then? Why were they not listening when we were saying, this violence is not the product of sort of the perversity of individuals. It is the product of a very specific ideology. In this case, the ideology of Muslim fundamentalism. People use different terms. That's the term that I use. And if we want to tackle this violence, we have to go after that ideology. I think that is absolutely true today as well. We're seeing this so-called theology of rape, as the New York Times dubbed it recently, being expressed by jihadist armed groups from Boko Haram in Nigeria to some of the armed groups in North Africa. In the Libyan context, we're seeing the rise of Islamic State, to obviously Iraq and Syria, where we know that this is happening on a massive scale, with the added element that Gay mentioned that's so important, the discriminatory element in that context where it is particularly justified, and you can read the awful justification that ISIS very openly authored, specifically of practicing rape against non-Muslim religious minority women, specifically Yazidi women. So this, to me, is one of the most worrying developments in the region. We're also seeing a tremendous pushback on efforts by women's human rights defenders to raise the issue of violence against women. And here's another example from Algeria. Wonderful effort to get a new law on violence against women in the Algerian context. Huge pushback in the parliament from the Salafist politicians in particular, saying, and one hears similar arguments sometimes even in the U.S., that this kind of law will undermine the family. So I think this dynamic of the push forward by women's rights defenders and the push back both by conservatives and fundamentalists is a very worrying regional dynamic. To me, the critical issue really is the issue of accountability. And I think it's very symbolic that not a single government in the Middle East or North Africa region, not a single one has ratified the optional protocol to CEDAW, which was one of the things called for in the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. And that optional protocol creates an implementation mechanism for the Women's Convention. And very telling that while some governments in the region have ratified the convention, even if they've done so with terrible reservations, not a single one has taken on the implementation mechanism because they're not serious about accountability. So on the whole at the moment, I think there are many pessimistic, many worrying developments. The most positive development is what women are doing on the ground to demand that accountability from the state, to demand that accountability from religious leaders, from community leaders, and from the international community. And I think what we need to do is to find constructive ways to support them.
Thank you for reminding us, too, Karima, that just the inexplicable notion that the U.S. is still not signed on to CEDAW. Along with just how can that be, and how can we let that be?
Or the Convention on the Rights of the Child.
Convention on the Rights of the Child, right? And surely we'll visit both of those issues later and see if we might come up with a platform for action to move that forward. Hassad Abiola Castella is someone that I had the privilege of meeting also before this gathering, because her work is well known around the world as she's developed many leadership initiatives. She was born into a political family in Nigeria and has witnessed both the transition of that country to its democracy, as well as now witnessing for the first time in Nigerian history, as you explained to me earlier, that a terrorist group has actually taken over, or an extremist group has taken over parts of the country. So indeed, Nigeria is at a very critical intersection. And how good it is to know that at this time, Hassad has taken a leadership position with the regional government to ensure that it meets the Millennial Development Goals, and we hope will have a strong representative role in the new Nigerian government. Hafsat, thank you for joining us today and for sharing your perspective on the status of human rights and in your country at this particularly important time where you've now transitioned to a new leadership but facing the huge threat of Boko Haram and other economic challenges as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Pat. Is it working, my mic? No?
No, turn it
Am I
up.
supposed to turn it? Let me see. It would help if I
I
just...
think it's doing better, so.
I think it is turned on. It was turned on already. Can you hear me? I think I turned it off now when I disturbed it.
Where is our technical?
Where's the...
Turn it up.
I should turn it on. Where's the on... Here?
There's a
Okay,
volume
can you hear
button
me?
on the top.
Can you hear me? No?
No.
Oh, maybe... Okay, I should go ahead and talk. So, thank you very much for the introduction. And I think the interesting thing about what's happening in Nigeria is the role that women are playing in the public space in Nigeria. When you look at the figures, we had elections last March. I'm sorry, after all your efforts. Thank you. So we held elections in March, this past March, and we brought in a new government. It's the first time in Nigeria's history that we'll have the Progressive Party, although some people will challenge that description of the current ruling party, but it's supposed to be the Progressive Party in Nigeria. And it's the very first time in Nigeria's history, which is now 55 years since independence, that we've ever been able to elect a progressive government. So for us, it's really a big deal. Some people would challenge that definition of this party because the party is progressive, but the person that is leading the party, the current president, you would describe him as conservative. He's not necessarily liberal, but in many respects, he's extremely progressive and radical for Nigeria because he's committed to ending corruption, which is a huge problem for us. And he's also very keen to tackle the security challenges that is posed by Boko Haram in the north. Now, he wants to challenge Boko Haram and he wants to tackle the problem in a militaristic way. And it makes sense because Boko Haram is killing many people. So far, they've killed over 15,000 people. They've created the largest number of internally displaced people in Africa. So we have about 1.5 million IDPs. And they're very violent. So at a point, they're taking over 15 communities in Nigeria. Although now we've pushed them back and we're really putting them on the defensive, reclaiming territory under the current president. But the problem, I don't think, can be tackled simply as in a militaristic fashion. And it's very simple if you think about it, because the person that founded Boko Haram, Muhammad Yusuf, his father had been part of another movement 25 years before called the Maitusina movement. It was also similar to Boko Haram. They were very violent, and they had to be put down. So we put down that movement, and then his son, the son of one of the members of that violent insurgency, creates another insurgency. So I think if we want to plan 25 years out, and we want to plan for peace, the answer cannot just be that we put down the rebellion that Boko Haram poses, but that we must actually answer the question that Boko Haram is asking. And I think that the question that the people involved in Boko Haram are asking is, do we belong in this place? Is there any place for us in this country? And if you think about the question, a lot of the people that are in Boko Haram, a lot of the young men, were the young men that were sent out from their families from the age, some of them from the age of 4, to fend for themselves and to study under a Muslim cleric, and some of them became radicalized. So now in Nigeria we have about 10 million young children that are out of school. I think it's the second highest number, maybe after India. So what are we doing? What is the plan for those children? Is there any plan for those children? What is the society, what is the government's responsibility, and how are the people of Nigeria going to ensure that the government meets that responsibility? Then also, even the ones that are at home, who is socializing them? The part of Nigeria where Boko Haram is most active, which is northeast Nigeria, the maternal mortality rate is 1,549 women dying per 100,000 births. Now, the target for the Millennium Development Goals is 250, but 1,549 women per 100,000 is the current rate of the women dying in northeast Nigeria. It's the highest rate in the country. My part of Nigeria, in Ogun State, where I'm serving, we lose 165 women per 100,000, just to give you an idea. And in northeast, where those women are dying, they're also married from the age of 12. They have among the lowest, in fact, they have the lowest rate of girls going to school. Yeah. And these are the women and girls who are girl children who are raising babies. Many of them, when they don't die, what are they going to teach these children? What do they know to teach? You know, a lot of the Boko Haram, men that went into Boko Haram and boys that went into Boko Haram, have no idea how you manage problems in a modern society. So I was unfortunate because in Nigeria, my mom was gunned down when I was about 20 years old. She was gunned down by soldiers in Nigeria. My father also was in jail, then he never came home. He died in prison. And we could have maybe become militants and all of this, because of course there was social injustice, there's something to respond to. But we were not trained to do that. We were trained to try to solve problems, to find people who are also upset, organize, lobby, go and speak to this, speak to that, march, speak in the media. What are they trained? How are they trained to respond to problems? And what are the opportunities for people who are upset about injustices? So I think the fundamental issue in Nigeria is that the government can solve this problem, and I'm sure that President Buhari is more than capable to tackle Boko Haram within the next 6 months to a year. But it's not going to be enough. If we want peace in Nigeria, we have to tackle the fundamental problem and to let those people know that Nigeria is big enough for all Nigerians, that there are possibilities for education, there are possibilities for healthcare, that they matter to us, that their lives matter to us. And we have to show it with concrete action. So the money that we're stealing now, that many people in government are always stealing, we have to find a way to criminalize that and make sure that the money gets to the poor where it belongs.
Well, I'm for starting a campaign. Let's elect her president of Nigeria. I suppose we can't vote yet, Hassad, but we could come and help you campaign. There is a very, by the way, inspiring film that has been made about Hafsat and her family and her leadership, and I do highly recommend it. It's called The Supreme Price. I believe that you can find it widely available, I hope, and somewhere on this wide internet of information, and please do make an effort to see it, and you'll understand why she and her family are giving so much back to that country. And we'll come back to the questions that you raised as well. Now, moving to another part of the world, Latin America, and in particular to Brazil, a country that not that many years ago was riding high economically and in so many other ways, and many people looking to Brazil as having solved problems and leading Latin America to a new, more prosperous future. With Jacqueline Pitangay, who has been a leader there for many, many years, a sociologist, a humanitarian. She's a former president of the Council for Women's Rights, a member of the board of the Brazil Fund for Human Rights, and on the commission there, too, for citizenship and reproduction. Jacqueline also serves with President Carter in many of his electoral observances around the world, and brings us a particular perspective now on the situation and the challenges for human rights in Brazil. Thank you for joining us, Jacqueline.
Thank you. I'm so pleased to be here. Being on a WLP event is like being on a family that brings us together from our diversity and bonds us with a common goal. So thank you, Mahnaz, and thank you, my dear partners and wonderful women in this round table, whatever. Your question makes me think of a movement that is on in the world. It's very difficult to think of a country in this interconnected world in a separate way. Of course, Latin America has its own characteristics, and Brazil has advanced, indeed. In spite of the problems we are dealing with now, the country has made what I would call a social revolution in terms of income distribution and distributive programs in relation to poverty. But also we have advanced enormously in terms of human rights. After 21 years of dictatorship, democracy was really a moment where civil society were already organized, black movements, women's rights movements, indigenous peoples movements. So our constitution is a constitution that has the metrics of human rights. And so I would say that the 90s were the decade for human rights, were the decades where women particularly were the main protagonists, I would say the main protagonists in the world arena, in all the UN conferences, and in our own national arenas. And that's the decade where we built the coalitions, as was mentioned here. And coalition building was really a change, because we were able to influence the UN, and we were able to influence our national arenas. So a lot was gained in the 90s. And then we entered this new century full of hopes. And what's happening? I mean, we are in a moment of backlash everywhere. Everywhere we look at, there has been backlash. In zones of armed conflicts, yes, but also in countries like Brazil, where there is not an armed conflict visible, there is no terrorism, and yet there is a growth, steady, systematic, organized, of what I would call Christian fundamentalism in a holy alliance with the conservative sector. And what we see now is that we are struggling not to advance, but to keep what was gained. It's like you go 2 steps forward and then you have, to be struggling to keep what was gained. And we are losing. Yeah. That's what's worrying me very much. And there is this relationship between national security and human security where all sorts of rights are being jeopardized and are being, so fragile in this moment. And I think that what we are seeing in relation particularly to women is that, as Mahnaz pointed out, women's body is a territory to be contained in different cultures, in different moments, in different periods of history, but it is being contained now in Brazil by this advancement of, I don't even have a word for that, for this extremism of conservative wave expressed either by religion or by a perspective of life. But what worries me is it's religious politics. They are in parliament. So when you bring together power, the use of power, and beliefs and an agenda, that it's an agenda to contain the advancement of women, it is very worrisome. And I think that in terms of strategy, we have to change. We have to change because I would say that in the 90s, it was women for women, along with women, in our thousands coalitions around the world. Now we have to think of making bridges. I mean, we have to think of the human rights movement at large, holistically, encompassing different agendas that have to support one another. Otherwise, we are not strong enough even to back up this advancement of these conservative, extremely conservative, but also powerful forces. that bring to people a sense of identity that maybe we were not able to, and that the human rights agenda as a passport is not bringing it. People do not feel the human rights agenda respond to their needs of shelter, food, and basically security. Even security from the unknown. You know, people want to feel that they are safe in their beliefs, in things that really are deeply rooted in the new human rights agenda, like women's sexual and reproductive rights, like LGBT rights, racial equality. All this is threatening for people. And I see that we are living then in a very difficult moment worldwide, but also a very difficult moment in our part of the world, in our country. And I think also that moments of crisis, we are going through an economic crisis that I hope will go away sometime. And political crises are a fertile ground for the growth of what I call the monster.
Yeah.
The monster that might become the Nazism, the fascism, whatever. But the monster, which is not recognizing humanity in the other, grows in moments of instability. So I am particularly worried with the world in general and with Brazil in particular.
You wanted to comment?
Yeah, I want to identify with Jacqueline's comments. I think that we, the movement, we really have to focus our organizing on a much more broad-based level. We have to move beyond the single issue focus that we've had, whatever your single issue has been. I think that was a organizing strategy for the 20th century that empowered many different groups. It's empowered the groups against racial injustice. It's empowered the groups for the rights of women. It's, empowered groups that work on behalf of children. So it was very successful, very useful in the 20th. The 21st century strategy has to be the bridge strategy. We have all got to, congeal into one vision of the future, coming out of the learnings that we've all had in our, if you will, single issue strategies. Also, we've got to recognize each other and hold each other up. The women's movement, let's face it, has had some problems lifting up the leadership of women of color. The struggles of some within the African descendant communities has been separate from indigenous peoples. We do not have the space now to be separate. We need to all be together and to be able to identify one or two things that are our greatest problems that are obstacles for us all. And I think that I think that what you have articulated is very important. This thing of is there a place for me, for us here? Out of that, I hear people saying, why am I not equal? Why don't I have what you have? Why is it that there is not a sense that we all should share equally? That's been a problem. And I think that it plays out in a lot of different ways. Plays out in regional struggles and wars against capitals, against a global south against global north. It isolates people so that they don't find in religion, what they used to find there, or they're going back to religion, when the real issue turns out to be a sense of wholeness from having your human needs met. Shelter, your need for food. You know, 1 billion people go to sleep hungry in our world. There's no need for that. We have enough food to feed everybody in the world. It's a distribution problem. Money, we have generated enough wealth in the world so that all the human needs can be met. It's a distribution problem. And I think that we need to, as we close ranks one with the other, we need to focus on this distribution problem. The sort of striking inequalities that exist within countries and between countries.
Thank you, Gay, and to each and every one of you for setting up truly the platform for the Women's Learning Partnership. That's why we're here, because all of these regions have now presented for us the very worrisome state of universal human rights and where we are and how and what has to be done. And Gay, you have advanced, as has Jacqueline and others. How do we get there? The bridge building can start here today. That's why we're here. So what are the foundations for that bridge? One of them, of course, is reaching across the silos of work that are represented in this room, the particular lens or focus that we apply to our look at these big issues. But the others, regional, cultural. Where do we look to start to put the foundations in the ground to change what you've described accurately as a backlash, or certainly a big gap between where we thought we'd be in Beijing and where we are now? Hafsat, you've advanced the notion that we can look more to government as a solution to some of the bridge building. Talk a little bit more about that. I think you might find there are others in the room who doubt whether or not, not your particular government, although there may be that as well, but just in general, can we really look to government to build these bridges?
I think we need to colonize government. I think we need to infiltrate government. I think we cannot afford to leave government on its own. And I'm sure that many in this community understand that, but sometimes when you talk to Africans there, and especially educated Africans that have opportunities even in the private sector, they'll be like, no, we don't want to go into government, they're so dirty. Well, that's why you should go in there. You know, that's precisely why you should go in there. So I was working in my NGO, which I created to honor my mother. It's called Kudirat Initiative for Democracy Kind. We're always doing what NGOs do, struggling for money. What a waste of time. I mean, so and we do very good work. We do leadership programs when we get funds, and then the funds dries up and you go again, you hustle. Yeah. You look again, and then you get, hey, should I really be doing that? Anyway, I was very lucky because I was appointed to be in the Ogun State government, which is just one state in Nigeria. So Nigeria has 170 million people roughly, and it's the largest economy, largest population in Africa. And Ogun State is just one of 36 states. We only have, 7 million people? But that's already more than all the people that my NGO has ever impacted since we were created in 1998. More. I mean, at least at a scale of 1 to 100, a factor of 2 more. And I don't have to look for money. I have a budget of $20 million, roughly $15 to $20 million every year to do projects. I mean, the issue in government is that the government, sometimes their money doesn't get to, so I was asked to use about $4 million to sink boreholes across my state in schools and communities. And I studied it. We worked with the civil servants as a team. Ogun State is really lucky. The Southwest as a whole in Nigeria, I mean, we have very highly educated public servants and everything. So we had a good team, and we looked, and we saw that we were asked to do 60 boreholes. And one of my team members, one of the civil servants, he said to me, Hafsa, we can do about 130 boreholes with this money. So we were confused. Why were we giving money to do 60 when that money can do 130? So who knows the answer to that trick question? Maybe you don't know the answer to that question. You don't know how it works. But we were supposed to sit on that money. We were supposed to share the money. Mm-hmm. What am I going to share?
Pocket the money.
Yeah. So in Nigeria, we said you're supposed to eat it. But the thing, and they encourage you to do that because what is the salary in Ogun State? So you have this budget, but my salary is like $2,000 a month. And you have this budget. And if you still have the money, do you know that probably nothing is going to happen to you? And that was the salary I was earning when I just graduated from university and I was still in the US. That money, $2,000 a month, or even less. I was earning more then. So I went to see my boss. My boss is the governor of Ogun State, and I looked at him and I said, Your Excellency, we have this money. We can do more than 2 times what we've been asked to do by federal in the approval request. Then he looked at me and he said, then Hafsat, let us do more than 2 times. And that's what we did. But if you go in there and you have new ideas, maybe they're going to support your ideas. Maybe they won't. They don't always support my ideas. But so what? At least you've made a case for the new idea, and it tells you that you need to go and build more support. But if you're not even there, so the thing the focus I have is to get women in there. And we're lucky, in 2017, in 2 years, we're going to hold local government elections. And I think the focus is to get women in there at the local government level. Right. Because local government are the ones that allocate money for health, for education. They're the ones that pay for the primary health centers, the nurses, the doctors. They're the ones that do the payments of teachers. So if you really want to impact people very quickly, common sense, if we apply it, says that let us focus there. And the good news about focusing there is that the men haven't started working on local government elections yet. And if we want women to have proportional representation at that level, we need to start early because they will have more obstacles than the more established male politicians. So I think we need to, exactly what you said, we need new strategies and we need to build bridges, but we need to also build the bridges where it matters. You're putting so much energy in the nonprofit sector, that's great, but let's get a lot of the activists with nonprofit energy that want to change the world, get them where the money and the power and the decision making is.
Wonderful call to action. Karima, I'd like you to add to this conversation because in the Middle East, I'm thinking Tunisia, Libya, other places where the revolutions were in so many ways sparked a new participation for women in the political process. And in Tunisia in particular, a large number of women moved into positions in government. So how big is your faith in the government as a bridge builder and a solution maker to the crisis in human rights?
I do think it's not enough to criticize government. I do think in many contexts, civil society activists, women's rights activists also have to consider the possibility of moving into the state sector, going beyond critique to actually offering a constructive alternative. Of course, that's not always possible. It depends on the nature of the regime in a particular country. So the strategy may need to be a very context-specific strategy. One thing that I think we have to take away from what are called in the regions the revolutions of 2011, about which some people have, I think, increasing skepticism given the way that it has worked out on the ground. One thing that we've learned, that is something, of course, that women's rights activists had learned in earlier generations as well, is that women's participation in and of itself is no guarantee of a positive outcome for women. And so women were huge, important players in the revolutions in Tunisia, in Egypt, and in Libya and elsewhere, and the outcomes for women have been ambiguous at best, in some cases outright negative. We've seen fundamentalist movements in particular try to capitalize on the new political space that opened up and to push back against, this ties into what Jacqueline was saying, push back against women's rights. So women, instead of being able to fight the optimistic move forward, which is what Tunisian women were talking about in 2011, suddenly had to fight to preserve what they had already attained. So, for example, Tunisian women then had to fight a huge battle after 2011 when Ennahda, the fundamentalist party that came to power, sought to put language in the constitution that said that women were complementary to men rather than equal. Now, Tunisian women won that battle. They mobilized, civil society mobilized. They did have actors both in civil society and in various parts of the government, and they were able to succeed. But I think participation alone, does not guarantee success. I think this issue of partnership is a very important one, but I also think you have to think strategically about partnership with whom and about what, and what the parameters are, and what you're not willing to give up or negotiate away to act in partnership or to act in coalition with others. Women sometimes have really lost out in coalition situations. And I think we do need those partners. We do. I think you're absolutely right, Gay. We can't work on one issue alone anymore, but we have to make sure that when we work with allies and friends, that the issues that are critical to us remain on the agenda and are not moved aside because they're considered embarrassing or inopportune at the particular moment. And when I look at the region right now, one of the absolutely critical human rights issues, and there are many, but one of them is maintaining, where this is the relevant term, or attaining, which is more often the relevant term, separation between religion and politics. Yeah. And when I was doing the 300 interviews for the book, Your Fatwa Does Not Apply Here, I heard this from women and from men, but in particular from women's rights activists across the entire region. And I was actually just in Tunisia in August for a forum that was organized by Tunisian intellectuals, very, very brave forum against terrorism in the wake of the terrible Sousse attacks that killed 37 people back in June, and decimated the Tunisian tourism industry. And one of the very courageous people who spoke at that event is a woman named Basma Khalfawi, who is one of Tunisia's leading human rights lawyers, and her husband, Shukri Belaid, was another of Tunisia's leading human rights lawyers who was assassinated back in 2013. And one of the things that she absolutely maintained, she really underscored, was the need to preserve what they call in Tunisia the civil state, the need to work for the separation between religion and politics. And I actually have to say, I think there is new movement to be able to talk about that issue across the region because there is so much fear of Islamic State. I was in the Gulf region presenting my book over the summer, and I found new space there to talk about this issue as well. So I think coalitions are very important, but we have to keep those difficult and perhaps seemingly controversial issues on the agenda of any coalition. And the last thing I want to say is we also have to empower young women. One of the other things, and allow them, it's not up to us, allow them the space to empower themselves. Everywhere that I went doing these interviews, I found a tremendous generation gap, that women of a certain age, I'm increasingly of a certain age myself, were the ones who were sort of speaking, and you would see them and they were visible. Many young women were active in many ways, but they weren't the ones given the microphone. And that, I think, we really have to change. The Beijing generation, we need to keep working, but we also need to share the space and learn from our younger colleagues.
Definitely want to come back to that, and also to the issue of being a woman leader who makes a difference for women. Gay, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I think sort of following on both these comments, the thing we have to do is to redefine power and how we shift that power. It's not about just getting in there, because I think that ultimately you'll never win that one. You have got to redefine what power is about, to set up systems of real accountability, and to have a sort of a transformative vision of what the future is to be. And if we don't have that before we get into these positions, then we're just like the other guy.
Well, part of what you and I talked about before, and I think this is a very big issue that we don't talk about often enough, and particularly when we're looking at government as an actor in building bridges, that when women get into power, we're not only dealing with all the stereotypes and all the paradigms that come before us, but we're very seldom given the time to develop the game-changing, paradigm-shifting work that's necessary, and often brought in under the worst of circumstances. If there's a terrible job in the world, give it to a woman to fix, and that we see from government through every other part. And then you have examples like in Brazil, Jacqueline, to bring you in to this conversation, where there is a woman leader, and everyone looks, oh, a woman leader, okay, now that she's going to solve all the human rights abuses, and she's going to put women's rights on the agenda. Help us understand what's going on, because again, it brings up the issue Karima brought up of religion and government, and some of the forces that President Rousseff is dealing with in Brazil.
Well, first I just want, on a personal note, going back to what Hafsat said about being in power. I was in a governmental cabinet position for 4 years. So being basically a civil society person, I do recognize that it's most important to be in power, to use power, because if you were talking about a national program, it's very difficult to do anything from a civil society NGO perspective. But I just think that the fact that power is in government, yes, it doesn't mean that that's the only source of power. Just want to say a few words about power, if I may, because you do have institutional power that is located in institutions, and that's not yours. You just use them while you are in that particular place, and you have to have very clear on your mind that power is not mine. That power is located on that institutional space, and I can use it for good or bad while I'm here. And of course, you have to have some personal power in order to be able to use it. But this is the institutional frame and machinery of a country that has to be valued. A country without solid institutions cannot survive. It cannot be democratic. It gives room for autocratic, authoritarian regimes. So I am very much for, to have very solid political institutions such as legislative, executive, judiciary, and all the pillars of what we understand by institutional power. On the other hand, there are so many other powers in society. The media, for instance. The media is extraordinary power every day more, and plus the power of ideas and the power of sharing platforms and commitments. And this comes basically from civil society organizations that might not have money but do have legitimacy, and this is a capital, do have legitimacy, and maybe because not so much involved in, some sort of limits and possibilities of institutional power, can dream, can plan, can propose, and can criticize. So I think that in order to have a vivid democracy, you have to have institutional power and also the power that comes from us, civil society, from different points, academic, organizations, etc. Now, in Brazil, we do have a very strong civil society. And what I want to say good about the crisis we're living in is that we have very solid political institutions. And we are going through an investigation of corruption never seen before, and the institutions are functioning. Actually, it was President Dilma who started the investigation on corruption. So I think that her figure as a woman, is very much, in a certain sense, preserved, because there has been no accusation towards her personally, but yes, in relation to her party, the PT party. And as a woman, she has a personal biography that is very much the biography of resistance in Brazil. She was a militant against dictatorship. She was imprisoned. She was tortured. And she built her life then within political institutions, basically political party and then cabinet positions. But I don't think biology is in itself a certificate of. I mean, you can have a woman and not necessarily have a woman that is progressively related to women's issues. It's not her case. She is. I mean, in terms of women's rights, there has been no backlash with her government. On the contrary, we have a strong minister for women's affairs. Now, I think that what we are seeing, what you raised in terms of building coalitions, is it's very important that we build coalitions. Each one doesn't lose its own identity on a coalition. And this is most important even for women, because what we see in many processes of democratization, of foundation of new orders, is women stepping in front and then being reduced, their agenda disappearing. So when I say about building coalitions, of course it's having very clear where we agree, where we don't agree, up to where we can go in terms of our principles and values, but also not to have our identity disappear. Okay, we are basically a women's rights movement or a women's rights coalition that are networking with a group of people who are environmentalists and a group of people that have race and ethnicity as the core of their mandate. But if we don't get together while the conservative forces are getting together in the world, I don't think how we can win being government or not being government.
Well, that's where we want to go. So how do we get there? Because gatherings like this, we know the will is in this room, but how do we translate what we know and our experiences and get past the siloed interest, which, as you say, it's important to maintain those interests, but how do we get past them to build the coalitions that are going to be necessary? Do you have examples in your experiences of seeing this work? Are there places we can look to for inspiration? We started the conversation about, okay, government's role, civic society, we know very well represented. Gay, you ask a lot of tough questions. How do we change distribution of wealth? How do we change the way in which migrant and diverse populations find their place in a displaced world? Tough questions that that every country is coping with. How do we get there? What are the strategies?
Well, I think that every good strategy starts with people sitting down together and thinking together and planning together. I think that we've got to very consciously create spaces where these coalitions can form and come with their own identities, make their own demands of each other within the coalition, as well as formulating a way forward. I don't see another starting point. But from that, I think that there are enough strong identity movements to be able now to sit down with each other and feel that we can make these plans in coalition. And, you know, I think that we start with a broad strategy, and that's why I call it a vision, that includes, you know, in equal parts, all of us and all of our issues. And then from that, we can develop tactics that can be played out in different contexts. But I do think, you know, one of the, Jacqueline has talked about the 90s as being the decade for human rights. Well, I would say that maybe she is referring to the series of conferences, global conferences, that occurred during the 1990s, starting out with the Vienna Conference on Human Rights, and then the social conference, the environmental conference. There was a conference on reproductive health and population, a conference on against racial discrimination. So, I mean, each of these conferences brought together 40, 50,000 people. Mm-hmm. And each of the conferences demanded that groups meet, a million times to develop platforms to take into the conference. Mm-hmm. That is the work of building a strategy. And it's out of that the women's movement was able to push onto the global agenda, onto the UN agenda, some pretty vital issues for us all. The whole strategy to end violence against women in its many forms, and all the things that have come out of that, and the reproductive and sexual rights agenda. Also, other coalitions were able to push things on to the global agenda. African descendants and the rights of Africans. So what I'm saying is we've got to have another decade of meeting each other frequently and planning and talking. And it's the work that we have to do to come up with the vision.
Yes. How's that?
So just to
tie into what Gay is saying. So in a few days is the sustainable, all the world's leaders will meet in New York to begin to look at, to commit to a new plan for the world with the sustainable development goals. And I think it's a huge opportunity for us. There's a goal specifically on women and girls, but there's several goals that are pertinent. I mean, to achieve them, we would need to tackle and engage with women and girls and tackle obstacles that they face in different areas. So it's a new beginning, and that gives us 15 years. So as I think the Dean said, and as Mana said, so what do we want to do? How do we want to engage? And I think, I really want to encourage us also to work beyond the usual suspects, because Manas was so gracious to, when I said I would come for this, and I said to Manas that, please, can you fly me into New York and then bring me by train from New York to DC, because the event is in DC. But I put all that headache on her, and I didn't even explain why. But Manas is an angel, and she agreed. And really, last week I went to DC because Gucci has this program called Chime for Change. I don't know if you know it. But Beyonce is one of the chairs of the program with Pinot. What is her name? The actress.
Salma Hayek.
Salma Hayek Pinot. And the head of Gucci is also one of the people. And they, one of the things they did was they held this event in Twickenham in England, a concert, and raised like 20 million pounds, which they now used the internet to find local organizations around the world to empower them to take action on education, justice, and health for women and girls around the world. And in a few days, they're going to, the meeting that we held last week was for them to merge with another group called Global Citizens. And they are holding another event in New York in a week or so with 40,000 people expected, with all kinds of musicians coming to sing, where they're going to raise huge amounts of money. And they're also getting presidents from many countries around the world to commit, because the financing for the SDGs is a problem. And they're starting a movement that's going to be putting pressure on these world leaders so that they can actually bring the money. They should find the money to finance these goals. So those are people that I would like us to partner with, because, people like Manaz and Lena and Gay and everyone that is on this panel and that you'll be hearing today are doing very important work. looking for solutions, policies that work, strategies that work, projects that work. And then you kind of need to partner also with, these are people meeting, Global Citizens gets 300,000 new members every month. These are young people all over the world. They're targeting that by next year, February, they'll have 30 million members. They need your ideas. The kind of revolutionary, radical, and practical ideas that you've developed that we know work can be given to them and they can run with it. So those kind of coalitions I'd love to see happening.
Yeah. We weren't naive enough. Yes, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to add one quick point, which is I think one of the challenges that we have is to take all of this very complex, sophisticated thinking, the policy discussion that Gay rightfully calls for, and find a way to communicate it in the world of Twitter. I mean, those of us living in the United States, we're living in a country right now where Donald Trump is the leading Republican presidential candidate. For people visiting from overseas, you know, this is basically a talk show host who's a very shady businessman with bad hair who knows how to talk on television. And really has no politics and no policy agenda. And they were just saying on CNN, you know, we're not in the era of policy anymore. So we have to learn how to take this sophisticated agenda and adapt it to the universe of Twitter. And I don't know how to do that. I mean, this is, I think, where we really need to look to our younger allies to take us forward on that. It's not even Twitter. I think it's kind of old-fashioned now. There's all sorts of other
Twitter's actually an old hat.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
But policy papers are not going to get us anywhere.
No.
We need slogans.
Yeah.
Right. Well, we could have had a whole nother session on media, and I would have had a lot to say about where we start from the reorganization and redistribution of power when it comes there, because there clearly aren't enough women in power in those positions. But we weren't naive enough to think that this group of four or anyone else on this particular stage is going to come up with an agenda for action that's going to get us exactly to that world we seek. But on the other hand, we don't want to end this session without hearing a couple of your ideas as well. We just have about 8 minutes left in the session, but if any of you would like to put forth another concept or another direction for us to go, please, the mics are there. And while you're thinking about that, I'm just going to throw out again the question which we're all talking about, and each of you has added something incredibly important to this conversation. But if there was one message, and I think, Hazat, you just delivered yours, there are coalitions in many different parts, from business to people who use their fame and celebrity, to forming coalitions with these very large global movements. All of that helps. Jacqueline, a thought on, is there one priority you would put forth for us to think about in terms of building this coalition, building these bridges that you first encouraged us to do?
Difficult for me to think of one priority. There's so many. What I think is that we are dealing with a very multifactorial, complex, with many different entrances and exits movement, and there are many things that can be done, from connecting with fashion world and money from private world, which has its limits also, has some possibilities, but has limits, and we have to be aware of the limits, to really finding a way to become a fifth force in the world. I mean, they're institutional, but we need to build a civil society worldwide coalition of people who defend a few key principles. The secular state, this is a key principle that might build coalitions around independently from where you come from and what your religion is, because secular state is the only way to defend freedom of religion. So you might group a whole people there who really are for, democratic principles, key democratic principles for equality and tolerance. I think tolerance is the world today when we are not recognizing humanity in the other. I mean, this is, I think, the key, but it's very hard because these people are scattered and hard. But let's believe.
It's hard, but we're used to hard.
Yeah.
Was there a question? Did I miss where the mic might have gone? Well, here we go. Okay, we'll have only time for two, I think.
Thank you. My name is Marzia, and I work with Feminist Majority Foundation, where I advocate for the rights of Afghan women and girls. I know when it comes to peace, we always try to not to include the forces and the troops. But in my opinion and experience, sometimes we do need, I call them supportive troops. For example, in Afghanistan, since the United States announced that they want to withdraw and bring back the troops, the situation started to get worse. All women activists started to get worried. Some of them even stopped working because of their family safety and their own safety. And even humanitarian organizations started to leave Afghanistan. And so many unemployments, including insecurity and other problems. Just last week, Taliban attacked UNDP's food trucks. So I believe that we should think about that as well. Even if we use the troops and equipment, to help people with food, and like you mentioned, distribution is a huge problem, all these backlashes. And second opinion, I believe only people, activists and civil societies sitting together, or governments sitting separately together and talking and talking about how to solve the problem is not enough. I believe we all should sit together, the government, civil society, women activists, to find a way to solve the problems. Let's think broad. Let's find who is giving the money and financial support to the ISIS. Let's find the countries who are supporting the ISIS and solve the problem in that way. Thank you.
Thank you. I would ask it to be a question if there's one left, because we only have time for one more. All right, good. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, please. Yes.
I am a member, I must say my English is not good. I speak German and Persian. I am a member of WILF, which set up the Congress of Beijing 1995 with peace train, with people from all over the world, 42 countries. You are talking about women's participation and work with governments. I think we have to work with governments. We have to participation in conflict resolution, which also the UN Security Council Resolution 3025 allowed us to do it. We have to work on it and to force our government to ratify, I think ratification, this resolution. Then we have a chance to do it. The other problem was she has also talked, we have to stop the arms supply to conflict area, which has made problem with Boko Haram or IS or something like that. I think it is not a religion problem in this area. It is something we could make with peace. We could solve it with peacekeeping, which doesn't allow the arms supply in this country. I think we can do a lot with our country if we participate in peacekeeping and conflict.
Thank you very much. There's so many voices in this room and so much good work represented, so I'm glad we got a chance to hear a couple of them. And I want to thank our panelists again. And it's always at this point when we come together in opportunities like this that we all get a little bit more worried and frustrated and feel like, there's so many problems and challenges in front of us, and yet we are here because we believe that as women, a women's community of activists and committed persons, that we can and do in fact make a difference. So with leadership like this and the leadership in this room and Manaz and the Women's Learning Partnership, there is an agenda that will lead us to that world we seek. Thank you for this time.